Wyoming Territory, May 1877. The sun was too bright for a morning like this. The wind blew dry and harsh across the hilltop cemetery outside of Sweetwater, kicking up dust around the widow as she collapsed beside the small, freshly dug grave. Nella Foster's hands gripped the edge of the wooden cross, as if holding tighter might keep her from sliding into the pit of her grief. Her black dress, faded from too many washings, clung to her knees as she knelt in the dirt. The grave was barely 3 feet long. The name carved into the pine marker read, Tommy Foster. Born August 1875, died May 1877. Her baby was gone. The world around her had turned silent like it did right before a storm, but there was no storm coming. Only heat and sky and the sound of her own breathing, ragged and broken. She did not hear the rider approaching. Victor Sutton had been passing through Sweetwater on his way to Fort Bridger when he saw the funeral from a distance, just one woman. No preacher, no mourners. The kind of grief that sat heavy on a person's shoulders, even from far off. He had not meant to stop, but something about the way she dropped to her knees beside that little grave made him pull on his reins. He tied his horse to the fence and walked slowly. His boots crunched softly on the dry grass. He did not speak. Nella heard the footsteps and turned, her eyes swollen and red. She expected pity. Instead, the man just nodded once and crouched beside her. "Your boy?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "Tommy. He was just a few weeks past his 2nd birthday." Victor looked at the grave, then at her. "I am sorry." She said nothing. "I will fetch some water," he said. "I do not need water," she murmured. "I meant for the flowers." He stood and walked back toward his horse. Nella watched him, too stunned by her own sorrow to wonder why a stranger would stay. She had no kin left. Her husband, Caleb, had died in a cattle drive accident last spring. Tommy had caught the fever 3 days ago. There had been no time, no help, no doctor near enough. By the time Victor returned, she was still there, sitting in silence. He brought wildflowers, purple lupines and white yarrow bundled in his calloused hands. He knelt again and planted them gently beside Tommy's grave. "They will grow," he said. "So he will always have something living close." Her lip trembled. "Why are you doing this?" He looked straight at her. "Because someone ought to." She stared at him for a long time. He was not young, maybe in his 30s, with sun-worn skin and dark hair beneath his hat. His voice was quiet, but steady in a way that made her feel like maybe she was not going to shatter. "I do not have anywhere to go," she said suddenly. "I cannot stay here, not in that cabin, not without him." Victor nodded once. "Then come with me," she blinked. "What?" "I was headed west," he said. "But that can wait. I have a wagon. There is an empty ranch house just beyond the ridge. Belonged to an old friend of mine who passed. I was going to check on it, maybe fix it up. You do not even know me." "I know you lost everything," he said, "and I know what that feels like." Nella hesitated. She looked down at the grave again, the tiny mound of earth. The flowers now resting against the cross, she whispered, "I do not want to be alone anymore." He did not reach for her. He just stood and offered his hand. She took it. Victor helped her up as if she were made of glass. They walked back to his wagon slowly. She did not look back at the grave. They crossed the ridge in silence. The land opened into a quiet valley, speckled with cottonwoods and the faint sound of rushing water. The ranch house was worn but still standing. Victor unhitched the horses and helped Nella down from the wagon. Inside, everything smelled like dust and cedar. He opened windows, let the light in. Nella sat on the edge of the bed in the small side room and stared down at her hands. Her fingers were still stained with dirt. Victor came to the doorway. "I will sleep in the barn tonight. You take the bed." She looked at him. "You do not have to do this." "I want to," he said. She swallowed. "Thank you." He turned to leave. "Victor," he paused. I am not good company right now." He gave a small nod. "You do not need to be anything right now." He left her alone and she cried again. But this time, it was not the kind of crying that made her feel hollow. It was the kind that reminded her she was still breathing. That night, Victor sat by a lantern in the barn, sharpening his knife and thinking about the woman upstairs. She was not just a widow. She was a mother who had buried her child alone. He had not seen that kind of sorrow in a long time, and something about her quiet strength, her honesty had grabbed hold of him and would not let go. He did not know what the next days would bring, but he knew one thing. He was not going anywhere. Morning settled quiet over the valley, light catching on the dew gathered along the porch rail. Nella stood barefoot on the boards, arms folded across her chest, watching the cottonwoods shift in the breeze. Her dress hung loose on her frame. The stillness around her was so complete, she could hear the hens scratching somewhere behind the house. Victor was in the pasture, mending the south fence. She could see the line of his back as he bent to hammer a new post into the earth, steady and sure in his movements. He hadn't spoken much the night before, but she'd heard him rise before first light, heard the soft clang of tack and the murmur of his voice as he calmed a restless mare. She stepped inside, boiled water, and set to washing what few dishes she'd found in the cabinet's plates rimmed with hairline cracks, a chipped enamel pot, 2 tin cups. The house had been empty long enough for mice to nest in the pantry, but there was flour still good in a sealed tin, and a sack of beans hung from the rafters. She cooked without thinking, hands moving from habit. That afternoon, Victor came in carrying a pail of water and a sledgehammer. His shirt was damp with sweat, dust clinging to his sleeves. He paused in the doorway. "You've been working," he said. "So have you." He set the pail down. "Fence'll hold for now. North line's worse off, but it can wait." She ladled beans into a bowl and handed it to him. "I found salt," she said. He took the bowl without a word and sat at the table, nodding his thanks. She joined him, folding her hands in her lap. After a few bites, he looked up. "There's a creek 1/2 mile west, runs clear, good fishing if you know how to coax him." She tilted her head. "You offering to teach me, if you'd like?" "I've never held a rod," he grinned faintly. "Then you're less likely to do it wrong." She let out a breath, not quite a laugh. "What made you come this far west?" He chewed, swallowed. "Left Missouri 6 years ago." "Too many ghosts in the soil." She waited. "Sherman's men burned through our county, took everything. Folks didn't rebuild, most just left. I stayed too long." She didn't pry further. Instead, she said, "My husband wasn't much for farming. He tried. But he had more sense for horses than for rows of corn. Tommy was always chasing chickens." Victor watched her face. "What was he like?" Loud. Laughed like he had a secret he couldn't keep. "Used to run barefoot into the yard before I could stop him. Always had dirt on his knees." She looked down at the table, fingers curling tight. Her voice cracked once, but she steadied it. "He called me Mama like it was a song." Victor let the silence sit. Then he said, "He sounds like he lived wide, even if it wasn't long." She nodded, mouth pressed shut. When the light started to shift golden, she rose. "I'll fetch water for the wash." Victor stood too. "I'll go. I can carry a bucket." He didn't argue, just grabbed the pail and followed her out. They walked side by side, not speaking. The path to the creek cut through a patch of wild rye. The air smelled of sun-warmed grass and damp earth. She lifted her skirts just enough to keep from tripping over the rocks. When they reached the water, she crouched at the edge, running her fingers through the cool current. "Feels like it's always been here," she murmured. Victor knelt beside her, dipping the pail. "Some things outlast us. Water. Stone. Grief." She looked at him, startled. His voice stayed soft. "It doesn't vanish. You just learn how to carry it." She studied him for a long moment, then looked away. The walk back was slower. She stopped once to rest, and he waited without comment. At the house, he took the bucket inside while she leaned against the porch rail, watching the sun begin to dip. That night, she lit a lamp and sat at the old writing desk in the front room. Victor had gone out to check the barn doors after a wind picked up. She opened the drawer, found a stub of pencil and a scrap of paper. She wrote Tommy's name just once, then folded the paper and placed it beneath the lamp. Victor came in, brushing dust from his sleeves. "Storms passed," she nodded. The shutters held. He looked at her for a moment, then crossed the room and pulled something from his coat pocket, a small, smooth stone, flat and gray. Found it near the creek, thought it might sit well on the grave. She took it from him, fingers brushing his palm. "Thank you." They stood like that for a beat too long. "I'll be up early," he said. "I'll have coffee ready." He gave a small nod and stepped back outside. She stood by the lamp a while longer, holding the stone in her hand. It was warm from his coat. She didn't pray, not out loud, but she closed her eyes and let the quiet settle deep. Not peace, not yet, but something close to stillness. And that was enough for now. By the end of June, the valley had begun to show its color. The cottonwoods deepened into green, and the high grass turned silvery in the wind. On the porch, a rocker had been dusted off and mended, and Nella sat in it now, mending a tear in the sleeve of a shirt Victor had left draped over a chair 2 days earlier. Her stitching was small and neat, the thread held taut between her fingers. She heard the gate creak and looked up to see him leading a mule toward the hitch post, 2 burlap sacks slung across its flanks. His hat was pushed back, and his jaw looked darker than usual with stubble. He'd spent the morning riding into Sweetwater for supplies. She hadn't asked him to, but he'd gone anyway. He stepped onto the porch, setting a sack by the door. Brought flour, coffee, and a few jars of plum preserves from the Widow Granger. "She said they were too sweet, but I reckon we can manage." "I've missed fruit," Nella said, tying off the thread, "even if it's drowned in sugar." Victor leaned against the post, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. Also picked up a plow blade. "Fella at the smithy said it had been sitting there since winter. Figured we might make something of that north patch." "I haven't planted anything since I was a girl," she said, folding the mended shirt. "Well," he said, "it's just dirt and seed. We can figure it out." She rose and took the sack inside, setting it on the kitchen table. He followed her in, pausing in the doorway. "You always work this hard?" she asked, lifting out a tin of coffee. He shrugged. "Idle hands don't sit right with me." She turned, one brow raised. "You ever let yourself be still?" "Some," he said. "Not often." She watched him for a long moment. "You sleep less than you say. I hear your boots on the porch most nights." He didn't deny it. "Some nights don't settle easy." She returned to unpacking. "You ever think about going back east?" He sat on the edge of the table bench. "Not once." There was no pause between her question and his answer. She looked over her shoulder. "Why not?" "Nothing left back there that feels like mine. Roads I knew are gone, folks too." She nodded. "That's why I stayed after Caleb died. I thought if I left, I'd be leaving the place where Tommy was born. But now," she trailed off. Victor didn't press her. She reached into the sack and held up a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" He scratched behind his ear. "Saw it on a shelf near the door. Thought maybe you'd like it." She peeled back the paper to find a length of blue calico, fine weave, scattered with tiny white blossoms. Her hand stilled. "I haven't had new cloth in almost 3 years. You don't have to use it for anything," he said quickly. "Just figured it might be nice to have." She laid the fabric flat on the table, smoothing the creases. "It's beautiful." He shifted, unsure what to say. She stepped closer. "Victor," she said, voice low, "you're not just a kind man, you see things other folks don't." He met her gaze. "I see you." Her breath caught, but she didn't pull away. That night, after the sun dipped behind the ridge and the last dishes had been dried and shelved, she stepped out onto the porch and found him tying off a lantern near the barn. The light caught the curve of his shoulder, the turn of his head as he glanced her way. She walked down the steps, the hem of her skirt brushing her ankles. "It's warm," she said. "Too warm for sleep," he nodded. "Sky's clear. Might be a good night for sitting." They stood a few feet apart, the hush of the land stretching wide around them. "I've been thinking," she said, "about the garden. I'd like to try carrots and beans if the ground's not too dry." He looked toward the edge of the field. "We'll water it by hand if we have to." They stood silent for a long while. Then she said, "It's strange how quiet changes when someone else is in it." He turned to her. "What kind of quiet is this?" She looked up at him. "The kind that doesn't feel empty." He stepped closer. Not touching, but near enough that she could feel the warmth from him. "I'll build you a trellis," he said, "for climbing beans." She smiled, small and real. "I'd like that." When she returned inside, she left the door unlatched. Victor stood on the porch a while longer, listening to the wind move through the tall grass. Then he sat in the rocker she'd mended, the boards creaking gently beneath him, and stayed there until the first stars began to show. By mid-July, the heat came down hard enough to make even the trees look tired. Dust clung to the windowsills, and the hens scratched shallow hollows beneath the lilac bushes to cool themselves. The garden rows, freshly turned and planted 2 weeks back, were beginning to show green. Nella knelt in the soil most mornings, tending shoots with a child's care. She hadn't spoken of the past in days, and Victor did not ask. Some things, he knew, were meant to be left alone until they rose of their own accord. That morning, she found him working beneath the porch, hammering new boards into place where rot had taken the old ones. He looked up when she approached, wiping his forehead with the inside of his arm. "I'm heading into the canyon," she said. "I saw wild currants blooming near the bend. Thought I'd gather some before the birds get them." He set down the hammer. "You going alone?" "I've walked it before." He stood, brushing off his trousers. "You shouldn't have to." "I don't mind." He didn't argue, only picked up his hat and followed her to the edge of the pasture, where the trail dipped into the shaded cleft between the hills. They walked without speaking, the path narrowing as it curved through granite and pine. The sky above was a bright, cloudless blue, and the air smelled of sap and sun-warmed stone. She stopped just beyond a fallen log, crouching beside a bush heavy with dusky berries. Victor stood nearby, scanning the tree line. "Did you grow up around canyons?" she asked, dropping currants into her apron. "No, I was raised in the Ozarks, thick woods, wet even in summer, too green," she said. "I like seeing the bones of the land." He watched her fingers move, quick and sure. "You've changed." She looked up. "How so?" "You hold yourself different, like your shoulders aren't carrying quite so much." She straightened, brushing her hands clean. "Grief turns quiet after a while, doesn't go, but it stops screaming." Victor nodded slowly. "I'm glad to see you stand taller." They filled her apron and turned back. At the ridge, she paused, eyes on the valley below. The house looked small from this height, smoke curling from the chimney. A hawk circled low above the pasture. "You ever think about staying?" she asked. He didn't answer straight away. "I haven't thought about leaving." "That's not the same." "No," he admitted. "It's not." They reached the barn before the sun dipped. He helped her rinse the currants at the well, his hands dark with grit. When she brought out a tin basin to soak them, he lingered, watching the water turn faintly red. "Tomorrow," she said, "I'll bake something with them." He leaned against the post. "I'll look forward to it." That evening, she sat at the loom in the front room, working the blue calico into a bodice. The fabric moved smooth beneath her fingers. Victor came in from the barn just after dusk, pulling off his gloves. "I've been thinking," he said, pausing near the hearth. "About the north field." She looked up. "If we can haul in enough stone, we could build a root cellar. Keep the vegetables longer when fall comes." She set the fabric aside. He stepped closer. "I don't mean to speak out of turn, but I'd like to make something here with you if you'll have it." Her breath caught once. "You're not just filling time, are you?" "No," he said. "I wake up here and it feels right." She stood. "I don't know what comes next." "I don't need to," he said, "as long as I'm beside you when it does." There was a long silence between them. Then she reached out and touched his hand, fingers resting lightly against his. "I want that," she said. He laced his fingers with hers, slow and certain. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods like a hush settling over a crowded room. Inside, they stood close, steady in the warmth between them. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't loud, but it was real, and it was theirs. The first rain came in August, slow and steady, soaking the earth until the air smelled thick with stone and root. Nella stood under the eaves, watching the drops darken the soil where beans had begun to climb the trellis. Victor built its joints clean and careful, the cedar stripped smooth. She'd hemmed her calico bodice and wore it now beneath her apron. Sleeves rolled past her elbows. The fabric had softened from washings, and it fit her like it had always belonged on her. Victor stepped up beside her, his shoulder brushing hers as he shook water from his hat. "They're saying the railroad might reach Rock Springs by winter," he said, eyes on the horizon. "Would mean more folks passing through." She glanced at him. "You thinking of selling the cattle off when they do? Just 2 geldings and an old steer. Wouldn't bring much. But I might trade for a milk cow. That'd help come colder months." She nodded, then turned her face toward the rain. "I used to think I'd leave Wyoming one day. Go east maybe, but I can't picture anything but this now." He shifted slightly. "What changed?" She looked at him full. "You, me. The quiet in between." He didn't reach for her, not yet, but his hand rested near hers on the porch rail, fingers close enough to feel the warmth. That evening they sat by the hearth while water ticked against the roof. Nella had found a worn book of poetry left behind in the ranch house, and she read aloud while Victor mended the leather strap on a satchel. Her voice was even, low, steady. When she paused, he looked up. "You ever write any of your own?" he asked. "Not since I was a girl," she said, closing the book. "Used to scribble lines in the corners of flour sacks. Mama said it was foolishness." He leaned back. "I'd call it something else." She stood and crossed to the cabinet, pulling down a clay jar. "You want coffee, always," he said. Later, as the fire dimmed and the night settled thick, she stood at the window, looking out over the dark fields. Victor moved behind her, his presence a quiet weight. "I've been thinking," she said. "We should mark Tommy's grave better, something more lasting." He nodded. "I've got a chisel. I can shape stone from the creek. We'll write what you want." She turned, eyes shining. "Thank you." He lifted a hand then, brushing a strand of damp hair from her cheek. "You give me more than you know, Nella." Her hand came up to meet his, palm against his wrist. "You made me feel like I had a future again." When he kissed her, it wasn't rushed. It was slow, like the way dawn reaches the edge of the hills, sure and quiet. She leaned into it, one hand on his chest, grounding herself in the steadiness of him. They married with the first chill of September in the air. No preacher came. Just the two of them standing beneath the cottonwoods, hands joined, words spoken soft and certain. Victor carved rings from antler, the bands rough but true. Nella wore hers on a cord around her neck, where it rested against her collarbone. They wrote Tommy's name into the stone and set it deep in the earth, planting sage and columbine around it. She sang to him as she worked, her voice low and even, not to chase grief away, but to lay it down gently. By October, the root cellar stood finished, lined with flat rocks. Victor hauled 2 at a time. Nella filled it with jars of preserved currants and baskets of carrots, each one brushed clean and wrapped in straw. They laid in firewood, patched the roof, and sealed the windows tight against the wind. The first snow fell early that year, soft and dry. Victor came in from the barn with frost clinging to his coat, his cheeks flushed. Nella put a wool blanket around his shoulders and pressed a mug of cider into his hands without a word. He looked at her, his eyes tired but warm. "This place feels like home now." "It is," she said. They spent winter wrapped in quiet labor and evenings by firelight. Nella stitched a quilt from scraps, piecing together the pattern in slow, deliberate rows. Victor read aloud from the poetry book when her fingers grew stiff, his voice steady as snowfall. When spring came, it brought wild iris blooming near the fence line and birdsong in the eaves. Victor built a cradle from pine, smoothing each curve with care. Nella lined it with flannel and tucked it near the bed. Their daughter was born under a soft April rain, her cry bright and strong in the stillness. They named her May, for the month Nella had once thought would bury her, and now, somehow, had given her back the world. Victor held her close that night, the baby tucked between them, his hand resting over Nella's. "You saved me," he whispered. She pressed her lips to his knuckles. "We saved each other." Outside, the cottonwoods bent in the breeze, their leaves whispering secrets across the land. Inside, laughter stirred the silence, and love earned, quiet, unwavering, settled deep into the bones of the house and stayed there, like light at the end of a long, dark road.